this ordering source for the embedded modal, which, among other things, stipulates that she is not supposed to drink Coke. All right. So perhaps the ideal world, according to the contract that she has with Pepsi Cola, contains a bunch of sentences, all of them referring to propositions, and those propositions may be, whatever here. I don't know. But then these guys are relevant for the truth of the embedded deontic modal. So these are the antecedent worlds. But then point-wise here, at each one of them, you ask, is the deontic claim true? So she drinks Coke, okay, but does she have to? That's a totally separate question. Is she required to? That, again, is evaluated with regard to this other ordering source. And you can convince yourself, also if you don't have much time left, but if you read through the handout, also if you read this, these papers, these two little readings that we have there, you can see that there's really no other way of doing that. These deontic conditionals, they don't make sense if they are interpreted in this way. If I do taxes and I want to do my taxes, that shouldn't be necessarily true. Right. But what this means is that now you assume that all conditionals are epistemic, or, well, I call this epistemic. And let's go with that. There is this difference between epistemic and circumstantial modality that we talked about yesterday already, right? So they're somewhat hard to distinguish, but sort of the same thing, or play similar roles. So it can be either of those. But in any case, there is a wide scope modal. That's the one that the antecedent restricts. Deontic modals take scope inside the consequent. So you have two modal bases, and they have little to do with each other. Then there are some details if you want to make this work, especially if you read carefully through this Frank, these 10 pages or so from the dissertation, and at the Frank. You see that you have to be very careful in setting this up, but that takes us a little bit beyond the scope of this. It can be made to work. And another argument for this is, of course, that you can have an epistemic modal. It doesn't have to be silent. The presence of a deontic modal in the consequence doesn't mean that there cannot also be an epistemic modal. As we see in these sentences in 20, if Max stays with grandma, A and B have only a deontic modal, C and D have an epistemic modal in addition to that. He might be allowed to take the dog for a walk. He might have to take the dog for a walk. Okay, so if they can show up optionally, the argument here is in this dissertation is that, well, we can just assume, as we do for all other conditionals, that they are in fact present in A and B as well. So we have doubly modalized conditionals. And that solves the problem. So it is in line with other things. I'm skipping over some of these things on the handout, which are actually fairly interesting, but so some alternative solutions that you might consider, but that don't work ultimately. You don't have to go through all of them. If you look at this tonight and have questions tomorrow, then ask them. If not, then we'll move on. And this also brings us to what I now cannot really go through, namely the section 4. about structural differences between epistemic and deontic modality. Or remember that this was called root modality at one point when I had this list here on the board yesterday. Now if you go back, you're not moving on. If you go back to 20 on page 14, for example, 20D, so, well, C and D, you have the epistemic model preceding the deontic one. And it is a very general, stable generalization in lots of languages that if you have two models like that, an epistemic one and a deontic one, they have to occur in that order. If you move one to the other side, then it becomes epistemic, and the other one becomes deontic. Now the section 4 here, so that's another claim, there's another sort of, piece of evidence for this claim that you have really two models in there. And that the epistemic one always outscopes the deontic one. Right? And section 4 is about an assumption that you see in many places in the literature, but that so far hasn't really been worked out. And it's not so clear that it's true, but there's a lot of intuitive appeal to it. So in the last 5 minutes we can just say what it is, and we cannot go through all the arguments for and against it. Namely that epistemic models sit somewhere else in the syntactic tree. They do something else compared to deontic models or root models. Remember, root models were deontic and dynamic, as Palmer called them. Dynamic ones involving volition and abilities. Right. Epistemic ones sit somewhere else in the tree, namely higher up. And in particular, the claim is that deontic models, or root models in general, interact more closely with the subject of the sentence. They actually do something with the subject. Subject is their subject. So these sentences like 22a, Bill should leave now and Bill should be here now. These have clearly preferred readings. They are both ambiguous, especially A perhaps. But if you just take these out of context, you're likely to give A root reading, a deontic reading. He should leave now, right? And you're likely to give 23A an epistemic reading. He should be here now. The philosophers here will not be familiar with the raising versus control. Do you know that stuff? Raising versus control and so on. Yeah, different ways for verbs to interact with their subjects. Do I have something along these lines? You have things like, now I'm not talking about these modal auxiliaries. Bill seems to be here, and Bill wants to be here. They look alike if you just see them like this, but then if you start playing with them, you see that they are quite different. For example, the first one can be paraphrased as, it seems that Bill is here, but the second one cannot be paraphrased as, it wants that Bill is here, or it wants Bill to be here. You cannot have this dummy subject, it. This is just one little test for this distinction. There are lots here in the handout, but we don't have time to go through them. You can do that at your, later on, or you can read this Brennan piece, which I hear that we now have a copy of, right? right? So some of these tests, like this, with this dummy subject, right? It seems to be, and it wants to be. They work also for epistemic and root models, and they identify, partly at least, a similar contrast between them, namely that epistemic models behave like raising predicates, like seem, and root models behave like the control predicates, like want. Let's not go through the arguments. The distinction between these two readings for these verbs, like seem and want, goes along with what I said, what I referred to as an interaction between the verbs and their subjects, in the sense that want does what linguists refer to as assigning a theta role to the subject. Talking to this mixed audience here, I really don't know how to say this. That is, Bill is not only syntactically, grammatically the subject of the sentence, but Bill is in fact portrayed as one of the necessary participants in the wanting, right? Bill is the one who does the wanting. He's the agent, or the, well, experience or whatever. Never mind. But he is the guy who does the wanting, right? Whereas with the first one, it's not Bill who does the seeming, right? The situation, the world, whatever circumstances, there's some evidence which suggests that Bill was here, right? Bill is not the subject of the seeming in the same way as he is the subject of the wanting. And again, for so these claims here are that there is a similar distinction with epistemic versus root models. In particular, that epistemic models are like 23a. Bill should be here now on the epistemic reading. They don't attribute a modal property to Bill. This sentence does not say that Bill has a property which can be paraphrased as, you know, should be here epistemically. Because Bill is not doing the judging here. There's a judgment involved, right? The sentence asserts that Bill being here is compatible with some modal base. Whose modal base is that? Is it Bill's? No, it's the speaker's or someone else's, right? Some observers. This is not about Bill's modal base and ordering source here. It seems to me that Bill is here now. Whereas in 22, things are different, right? Bill has the obligation. He's the one who has the obligation. Well, that's just a piece of evidence. The rest of the this handout, as well as the rest of the readings, the Wurmbrand and the Butt papers that are in this package, they talk about this, and basically the consensus currently, as I see it, as to the extent that I follow this topic, is that it's quite uncontroversial that epistemic models are raising predicates like this. It's not so clear that deontic models are not raising. There are very many subtle differences. There is some evidence that deontic models are ambiguous between sort of a raising reading and a control reading. But then authors argue that that ambiguity should not be confused with a structural ambiguity. It's just a semantic thing. So some claim that all models are raising. I don't know the correct answer. So I just brought this up. I would like to end this here. I brought it up because it's a bit related to the story about these deontic conditionals, where I said you have an epistemic model always there, taking wide scope over the whole sentence. and then whatever else is there, modals like deontic and so on, they are interpreted inside the scope of the epistemic. Now I think all of this is compatible with the idea that even if we don't talk about conditionals, it may still be the case that deontic modals are always embedded under an epistemic modal that might be silent. I think that's a reasonable assumption, and that will again be part of what we'll talk about tomorrow with regard to the Kaufmann paper. Okay. And I would like to leave it at that. Let's just stop here. If you want to discuss this sort of thing some more, we can do so tomorrow, but it's perhaps not so essential. You decide, you choose. Asate.
The day after tomorrow.
Yes, thanks. The day after. Yes, I still have to write the handout. Just joking. You can bring it up again, but there isn't really much more than we can say except go through some of these arguments a bit more closely. It will still be a bit inconclusive. It's not really known what the syntactic structure is, what the difference is. There are lots of intuitions, but it's a bit unclear. I would like to move on Sunday to this temporal modal interaction according to schedule, but you decide. Okay, so that's it for today. Thanks.